Happy Thursday. I'm not sure if all of you did read that or had the chance to see it, but as of the 13th of November, it looks like the Liberal Party backed out of their commitments to net zero. Now, One Nation, which is Pauline Hanson's party, has always been opposed to net zero. The Labour Party is still strongly advocating for net zero and fully backing it, and of course the Greens are supporting and backing it as well. However, I'd love to hear some of your thoughts in the comment section. Were you expecting that from the Liberal Party, and do you think it's more of a ploy to get people to vote for them, since they started seeing a decline in their numbers and an increase in One Nation? However, I thought it'd be a good opportunity to discuss net zero. What is it? Some of the history of fossil fuels. What would the world look like in our lives without fossil fuels, and the difference between conservationism and climate change. So what is net zero? Well, it's essentially balancing greenhouse gas emissions with the amount removed from the atmosphere. The government has been trying to do this by reducing emissions from energy, transportation, agriculture, and different industry sectors. And I know a lot of Australians have felt the brunt of this, mostly it comes down to cost of living. Their energy prices have gone up. The cost of a coffee now, what is it, between $5 and $7? I would actually be interested in hearing what's the amount you're paying for coffee right now, and what are you ordering? That's the other thing, but let me know, because I'm really curious. I think my local coffee is around $6. So I've started making them at home for the most part, because I just can't, the value for money is just not there right now. Anyways, yeah, the government, what they've been doing to try and counteract that is pushing renewable energy. So solar and wind are the primary ones here in Australia. I think they focus more on solar. I would comfortably say that, especially with the amount of sun and heat we get here. However, that is what net zero is. The history of fossil fuels is a bit interesting. I won't touch on all of it. I'll try to do just like a basic summary of it. But fossil fuels are going to be coal, oil, and natural gas. So there are these hydrocarbon-rich kind of remains, I'd probably say that, from ancient plants and animals that have been buried in the ground for millions of years. I know sometimes you may flick through YouTube and see that, where it says fossil fuels are made from dinosaurs, and I don't know if that's exactly true. There's probably some truth to it, but they're things that we dig up out of the ground, and we've utilized them in different ways for a long time. We didn't just start using fossil fuels over the past couple hundred years. We just have more people, and they've become obviously more of a part of our lives. However, we do have evidence that in ancient China, about, I think it was 1000 BC, that they were using coal for heating purposes. In ancient Persia, around 300 BC, that they were using oil for their lamps and for herbal medicine, things, obviously to make them feel better in certain ways, kind of holistic approach to it. And then we hear more about the fossil fuel industry surrounding the Industrial Revolution, or the 18th and 19th centuries. So that's when we started getting gas engines, the automobile, the airplane, the Wright brothers. All of that movement came to be. Post-World War II, we started getting gas pipelines that were used for heating and electricity in a lot of homes. And it really changed how people lived, their levels of comfort, society. There was a lot of economic growth seen in that, and I'll touch on that even with the Standard Oil Company, which was prior to World War II. But fossil fuels, as of the 1970s, I believe they were about 80 to 90% of all global, or they accounted for about 80-90% of global energy. And fossil fuels, you kind of hear that and you think, well, it's just energy or a few different things, but actually 90% of pharmaceuticals rely on fossil fuels. 90%. And that's a figure I've looked it up in several different locations. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, if you found something different, but that's what I've been able to find. Not always directly, but packaging, even in glass containers, fossil fuels are used to make plastic, glass, and the actual medications themselves. That started John D. Rockefeller, I'm sure many of you have heard of his name. He did a lot. He was a businessman in the United States, in the 18 and 1900s. He went on, probably his biggest achievement was creating Standard Oil. It was this massive oil monopoly where he kind of, he bought out people underneath him, and he kind of consumed the market until, I think it was around 1911 or so, where the US government recognized it was a giant monopoly. They made him break it up, and that's why we have, oil companies we know today. So like Exxon, Mobil, what's another one? I can't remember the other one off the top of my name. But anyways, that's how those kind of broke apart and expanded. So it wasn't one person controlling the entire market. However, he went on to create the General Education Board with a guy, I think his name, Frederick Gates. And that changed how we know education today, kind of using what this other man, thought would be best. But as well as that, he also went into the medical side, or the pharmaceutical side more specifically. Around that time, people in the United States were using Native American Native American approaches to medicine and more of the holistic style. And John Rockefeller didn't necessarily think that that was the best approach. Some people will say he was just being money hungry and he wanted to expand his oil out to make money, making them into pharmaceuticals, or the pharmaceuticals we know today. Other people say, well, he was a philanthropist and he was actually interested in trying to help people out. So you can be the judge of that for your researches. But anyways, he went on. I think it was around 1920, about 50% of the medical community had kind of shifted into science-based or evidence-based approaches using medications. And that was kind of the start of separating this Eastern and Western medicine. And that's the reason why in Australia and different Western countries that we have Western-based medicine. East, while they do have Western medicine and surgery and those approaches, I believe they do stick to more of a traditional holistic approach when they can. But an interesting fact about oil and how that played a role in pharmaceuticals. Fossil fuels also impact the economy at the GDP level, at the personal level, in our superannuations, which is a retirement fund, and even if you invest directly in shares, funds, ETFs, whatnot. So between 2023 and 2024, about 25% of fossil fuel exports made up the Australian GDP. So that is quite a lot. I don't think the actual GDP amount that was categorized as fossil fuels reflected that 25%. I think it was more like 2 to 5%. But still, there's a portion of the Australian GDP that relies on fossil fuels. But it's not just reliance on fossil fuels. Industries, as previously mentioned, they rely on them. Farmers, agricultural engineers, our transport systems, just airplanes, getting places. You've got to have fuel. We don't have the technology for that, and airlines are not, unless they're government funded in the Middle East where they've got plenty of money because of fossil fuels. Well, you want safety. You want to know you're getting somewhere safely. Anyways, regarding superannuation and shares, because fossil fuels make up a portion of our GDP and how we experience economic growth. Well, to remove those would mean removing money from your superannuation, removing money from your share account. You may not be directly invested in an oil company or a mining company. However, you'll notice that there's an interconnected nature in people, in the world, in trade, in business. So if fossil fuels were to be removed, like as net zero would imply, or the initiatives behind net zero, I guess the goal of net zero is what I'm trying to say. If that were to happen, the people would experience financial loss as a result. Even more so is the amount of jobs that are in sectors involving fossil fuels. When I looked it up, it was around 100,000. So that's going to include, miners, engineers, people who, I mean, it can be anything from administrative to the people at the top. However, that's a significant number of jobs, and if those industries were removed, there could be a significant number of people that are displaced. And we know how difficult it is, especially when people start to get older. Well, if their entire industry has been in the oil industry or mining, fossil fuels, if that doesn't exist, that there's a good chance that they may be seen worthless, or not them necessarily, but their resumes. And I think you know what I mean. That people are not going to give them the time of day because they don't have the adequate skills. Not everybody in the companies but there would be people in that. So I think that's something we have to consider. However, the government knows that we can't go to net zero, and that's what I find interesting, because they push these initiatives, but they know that without an equal economic replacement for fossil fuels, that it's not feasible, it's not sustainable, because they can't suffer that type of financial loss, in Australia or in other countries. And that's part of the reason that countries have fallen so behind in their initiatives. Well, a lot of I guess I would say when it comes to net zero, the Paris Climate Agreement, a lot of those things, well, it sounds good in theory. A lot of things sound good in theory, but when used in reality, or put into practical matters, it plays out quite differently. So I think the government knows this, but they're not quite transparent with people about it. Maybe people on specific end who are really pushing this, and not people who want to have a balanced approach. But I'll get into that a little bit later, because there's a difference between climate change and conservationism. Climate change is essentially, it operates off the free market through industry, through economic growth, and conservationism is something different. It's actually just protecting the land around you, the resources around you. You're not using it for money grabs. Here in Australia, the primary renewable energy source is solar. The amount of sunlight we get and the strength of the sun here. So that's the most reasonable, feasible renewable energy source, and it's being pushed that way. However, solar panels don't come without conflict and contradictions of themselves. Most solar panels are made in China, in a region called Xinjiang, and a large portion of that region are Uyghurs. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But it's a Muslim population in China, and they've essentially been forced into what I can only describe as being similar to concentration camps. There's surveillance, they're forced into labor, into many of these industries. There's a lot of evidence that points to them actually having to work in these industries, such as solar panels. So there may be a humanitarian issue at play. While some people are trying to implement greener initiatives, whether you agree with that or not, or that's not really the point. But it's at the same time, it looks like there's a humanitarian issue at play at the same time. The best way I can describe solar panels, or to summarize it, that it's quartz broken down into silicone, and then silicone is heated up and broken down into something called polysilicon, and then they're made into solar panels after that, through different ways. But basically it's raw minerals or raw materials that are converted into these energy producing products. I already discussed some of the pros when it comes to solar panels, where there is possibility for it to reduce people's energy bills, and that's a fantastic thing. I completely agree and support why people want to do that. However, when it comes to climate change and these type of initiatives associated with net zero, I think it's interesting that again, as I said earlier, that this is an industry replacement. Well, they want to get rid of fossil fuels, they want to go to net zero, but at the same time, they're not doing it for the purpose of they're not fully doing it for the purpose of the environment, because if they were, they would have addressed this sooner. Solar panels, I think it's less than 5% are recycled in Australia. There's no money to be made in recycling solar panels, and it's actually just because it's so expensive. People don't want to invest in that, or I say people, where it's more like companies, people who have the money to build these, that maybe someday that'll change, but as of right now, it's very expensive to actually recycle them and break them down. So you have the majority of solar panels, they last anywhere from about 10 to 30 years, depending on the quality you get. When they go to the landmine, well, the glass breaks. When that glass breaks, there are toxins inside of them. I think lead, what were the other two? Lead, cadmium, and antimony. I believe it was those two. Not all of them have each of those products, but whenever the glass breaks, like as would happen in a landfill or just the breakdown, the rain would cause some of that acidity to flow out of them, and that's going to go into the soil. Those toxins are going to demolish, they're going to erode the soil that's going to get in the water systems, and that harms both humans and wildlife. Which brings me to the point I brought up earlier, where there's a difference between climate change and conservationism. Climate change is based on fear, and I want to explain that a bit, because I know there's a lot of younger people, and they take these things so serious, and I've been exposed to things, you know, about climate change anxiety, climate change depression, things that people are undergoing, and it's easy to just look at that and dismiss it, to laugh at it, to be like, well, that's ridiculous, like why are you going to think like that? But you have to remember that a lot of these people are quite young, or the ones that have grown up with this, that they've been hearing this for such a long time. They've been hearing that when they're older, the world is going to catch fire, that there's going to be floods. They've essentially been told that they're going to die in horrific ways because what older generations are doing to the planet. And I think it's pretty reasonable, if you put it in that context, to understand why they actually have fear and anxiety. Now, whether you think that's a good reason or not, I'm not going to go into that right here. But I can understand why they have a level of fear and anxiety, and why some people behave the way they do about this. The entire climate change industry, like how it's been presented, it's interesting. So, I mean, everything is urgency, fear, death, threats. I mean, it's quite negative. It's very pessimistic. There's other ways to get people around it, and that's why I prefer the conservationism approach, where it's I'm a big fan of Steve Irwin. Always have been. I grew up with him. I'm sure many of you did as well. In Australia, I don't think people quite appreciated him as much as other people around the world, maybe until he passed away. But he said something that I thought was profound. He said, people want to save the things they love. And he did that. I think even David Attenborough, like when you watch his documentaries, he shows people what to love about animals, about the planet. You're not going to find many people where you approach them and they're like, hey, do you care if this animal goes extinct? Do you care if these terrible things happen to the animals or the forest? And most people are not intentionally wanting to do that. There may be some people who don't know the implications of certain things, but they don't have bad intentions behind what they do. Most people are just trying to get by. They're trying to do the best they can. They're trying to stay afloat. And you can't really bring someone down for that. So I think the point of this video today is to let people see different perspectives when it comes to net zero. There's going to be people, this is a spectrum, people's belief, people's values, what they think of it. It's going to be, it's going to range. You're never going to agree 100% with people. And I actually want to encourage that, whereas most people can't even find a compatible partner or a compatible spouse, but they expect politicians and governments to be perfect. And you know what? You're not going to find it. I think it's a good thing to look at things from a different perspective, to try and understand it, and to be open to that. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be frustrated. And I understand why people are. I have some frustrations with what the government does, and I think that's okay. But I don't think just rage baiting, getting angry, we know that's not going to do anything. Nobody's ever changed your mind because they yelled at you or they made nasty comments to you on the internet. So I don't think that's the point. The point of this is to just listen, have some dialogues, have some discussion, research some things for yourself. Feel free to do that on anything that I've spoken about today. I'd like to hear in the comments any struggles you're having, whether it's cost of living, as I said earlier, the cost of coffees, the cost of breakfast, cost of anything. Let people know. Vent that there. I think it's a good thing for people to hear that in a constructive way. I'll stand by this, that I don't think people on either the left or the right of the political spectrum, most of those people don't intentionally want to hurt other people or the planet. That's not what people are thinking. They're just trying to get by. They're trying to do the best they can. And oftentimes people don't have the time to sit there, look things up, to read about it, to do it properly. So they are fed things by the media, things, just the regular talking points. And those are things that I kind of want to stray away from. That's one of my goals. I hope it can be one of your goals. I hope that's one of the reasons you're listening to this. Like, we're here to have real discussion, authentic discussion, really go into it at a deeper level. However, I think it's also reasonable, and this would probably be more pointed or more directed at people who are on the political left side of the spectrum, that it's reasonable for people to want financial security and for them to lower their cost of living. If you've ever read the book by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, he makes a really good point, and he points out that when people lose hope, that's it. And if a government does that, if they allow people to lose hope, that when people can't afford a house, when they can't afford a family, when they can't afford to eat, what hope do they have in their future? And when people lose hope, well, that's when they start voting differently. They can start acting out. They go into survival mode. They're not in thriving mode. They're not even necessarily in just being content mode. They go into actual survival mode. And that sets off a primitive style of thinking in the brain. We don't want that. And I think we're starting to see that. That's where a lot of the frustrations are brewing. Again, I said I get it. But that's something the government will eventually have to address, that you don't want a population in survival mode. You want them to have legitimate hope, not just hope dangling by a string by something that they know is never coming. I think Australia has to decide whether they want to go down the climate change approach or more of the conservationist approach. Again, climate change approach, you're swapping one problem for another. Problems fossil fuels today, what will it be in 100 years' time? If we switch over to renewable energies, the landfill issue, the recycling issues, the production issues, allowing China to be the prominent force. I know when it comes to oil and fossil fuels, it's kind of Saudi Arabia, the United States, Russia, Brazil, Australia plays a key role in it, and some other Arab nations. But there's going to be a drastic power shift if you give China that power. And that's up to you to consider. Is that something you want? Is that something you want for your children in the future? Up to you to decide. However, I think the conservationist approach is more about balance. People have to thrive, people have to survive, and then it's good if they can thrive. So does wildlife, so does the ecosystem. It's all interconnected. We're all balanced. And another thing that I think government is not addressing, even when it comes to migration, when it comes to, climate change, conservationism. Conservationism does not allow for mass migration. It takes a natural approach. And obviously, we're not in a world where everything is natural, but you need to have balance. If you have mass migration, you have a significant amount of people moving here, well, you're going to require more housing, more infrastructure, more water, more resources. And if it's not in line with how things would naturally go, if the population was gradually having children and increasing at a stable rate, you're going to see the cracks are going to show. Anyways, I just want to say thank you for listening. Thank you if you watched my other video. I hope to post some more videos soon. If you have any suggestions, any thoughts, any comments, feel free to put them in the comment section below, and I will see you next time. Thank you.